A woman billionaire visits her son's grave and sees a black waitress crying beside a little girl. The child has the exact same eyes as her late son, haunting the billionaire for days. Then a truth is revealed that leaves her completely shocked. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, casting a blurry curtain over the morning sun. Inside the study, Clara Whitmore sat alone in a high-backed leather chair, her posture rigid, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The room was silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. A fire crackled lightly in the marble hearth, untouched. She hadn't moved in nearly 20 minutes. Clara's eyes were fixed on a silver-framed photo on the nearby side table. In it, her son Jaden was 7 years old, missing a front tooth, grinning from ear to ear as he held up a tiny plastic trophy, his first soccer award. His curly brown hair had always been a little wild. Clara used to try to tame it with gel before picture day, but it never worked. She remembered the way he'd giggle when she kissed the top of his head. He used to run into her home office after school, dragging mud across her Persian rugs, proudly showing her every drawing, every test, every scraped knee. She blinked slowly, reaching for the frame, running a finger across the glass. There were other memories, too. His first day of college, that time, he cooked her a disastrous dinner and nearly set off the fire alarm, the text message he had sent her on her 50th birthday. "To the most unstoppable woman I know. Thanks for raising me like a lion." But then her throat tightened. Her mind, as it always did, circled back to that morning. The phone call. It had been just past 6. She was sitting in this same chair reviewing the latest quarterly earnings. The call came from a hospital in upstate New York. Car accident, a slippery road. Jaden's car had gone over the railing. No one else was involved. There had been a fire. The doctor had used words like instant, unavoidable. We did everything we could. Clara had not screamed. She had not cried. She had simply stood up, walked to her bathroom, and vomited into the sink. That had been exactly 3 years ago. Today, the same dull ache pressed into her chest as she set the photo back on the table. For a moment, the room around her faded. It didn't matter how many foundations bore her name, how many boards she chaired, or how many towers rose in the Whitmore skyline. None of it filled the hole her son had left behind. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She reached for it slowly, barely glancing at the screen. Her assistant's name lit up. She answered, "Yes. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. Just confirming your 11 o'clock with Senator Thorne, followed by lunch with the Turner Group at 1. Then you have cancel all of it." Clara said, her voice sharp but steady. There was a pause on the other end. "Ma'am, I said cancel everything today. Should I reschedule for later this week?" "No," she said firmly. "No rescheduling. I won't be available today. Clear my calendar." She hung up before another word could be said. Clara rose from her chair and walked toward the tall windows. Outside, the sky was still overcast, the trees swaying gently in the early autumn breeze. She stood for a long moment, then turned away. In her bedroom, she changed into a long black wool coat, wrapped a gray scarf around her neck, and pulled her gloves on tight. She didn't bother with makeup. She hadn't worn any on this day for 3 years. There was something almost sacred about keeping her face bare. The woman who mourned Jaden wasn't a CEO or a figurehead. She was simply a mother. The Bentley was waiting in the driveway when she stepped out, her driver already holding the umbrella. "No need," she said, waving it away. "I'll walk when we get there." "Yes, ma'am." The cemetery was 30 minutes away, tucked behind the edge of a small lake, quiet and rarely visited. Jaden had loved it there as a child. He used to bike around the trails, feed the ducks, throw stones into the water. Clara had chosen the spot herself. It was the only decision about his death she had made entirely alone. The car pulled through the cemetery gates just as the clouds began to thin, letting in soft gray light. Clara stepped out slowly, holding a small bouquet of white lilies in one hand. Clara Whitmore's heels clicked softly on the stone walkway as she moved slowly, deliberately toward the far end of the cemetery. She stopped beside a tall headstone carved in white marble. Jaden Michael Whitmore, beloved son, loyal friend, gone too soon. Beneath the polished name, a small inscription read, October 25th, 3 years ago today. She bent down to place a small bouquet of white roses at the base of the headstone. Then, standing again, she closed her eyes. For a moment, the world went still. That's when she heard it, soft, muffled sobs, a child's voice, broken and trembling. Then another voice, older, low, and pleading. Clara's eyes snapped open. She turned, heart quickening, and looked across the row of headstones. Not far from where she stood, just beyond the curve of the path, was a woman, young black maybe, in her mid to late 20s, kneeling in front of Jaden's grave. Her dark curls were pulled back into a loose bun. She wore a faded sky blue waitress uniform with the name Melba's Diner stitched above the pocket. Beside her, a little girl no older than 4 clung to her arm, her face buried in the woman's side, her small shoulders shaking. Clara's breath caught. She took a step forward, squinting slightly. The child looked up. Hazel brown eyes, deep, vivid, full of light eyes Clara knew in an instant. Eyes she had stared into from the moment Jaden first opened his at the hospital. Eyes that had once looked up at her from the stroller on Sunday mornings, that had sparkled during soccer games and softened during bedtime stories. Clara blinked. No, it wasn't possible. She stepped closer slowly now, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile reality around her. Her voice, cold and measured, cut the silence like a blade. "You're in the wrong place," she said flatly. The woman turned, startled. Her face was streaked with tears. Her dark skin glistened in the dim morning light, but she held her chin up. "I'm sorry," the young woman said quietly. "We didn't know anyone else would be here this morning." Clara's tone didn't soften. "This is a private moment. I understand," the woman replied, rising to her feet, gently guiding the little girl behind her. "We won't be long." But Clara didn't move. She stared hard at the child. The resemblance wasn't just passing, it was impossible to ignore. Her voice dropped, controlled but sharp. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated, as if measuring the weight of her words. "My name is Danielle Harper," she said. "This is my daughter Nyla." Clara folded her arms, keeping her distance. "Why are you here? Why are you at his grave?" Danielle looked directly at her. Her voice didn't tremble this time. "We come here every year. On this day." Nyla wanted to bring flowers. Clara's eyes narrowed. Why? Danielle looked down at the child, then back up at Clara. "Because Jaden Whitmore was important to us." The silence that followed was thick. Clara felt a sharp sting rise in her throat, but she forced it down. Important. What could that possibly mean? She took another step forward. "How do you know my son?" Danielle's jaw tightened. Her voice softened, but it did not falter. "He was Nayla's father." Clara's world stopped. She stared at the woman in front of her as if she had spoken in another language. Her gaze darted between Danielle and the girl. Her heart was pounding now, echoing in her ears like a drum. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't find the words. "You're lying," Clara said, her voice shaking for the first time. "Jaden would have told me." Danielle looked away. "He wanted to." The little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama," she whispered. "It's okay, baby," Danielle said softly, pulling her closer. Clara clenched her fists inside her gloves. Her voice hardened again. "You expect me to believe that my son had a child with a waitress, and I never heard a word of it?" Danielle flinched but didn't back down. "Believe what you want," she said. "We're not here to ask for anything. We just wanted to honor him." Clara stepped back as if burned. Her mind raced with questions. Was this extortion a setup? Some trick to get money? She shook her head, her voice low and full of contempt. "You should leave." Danielle nodded. "We will." She picked up Nyla, held her close, and began walking away. Clara stood frozen as they moved down the path, disappearing into the fog. She felt her body trembling, but she didn't know whether it was from rage or confusion or fear. Then she looked down at the grave, at the flowers she had placed so carefully. They suddenly felt meaningless. Clara turned away, her breath shallow. In all her years of building empires, of manipulating headlines and silencing scandals, nothing had ever knocked the wind from her like the gaze of that little girl. Because for just a moment when Nyla had looked up from the grave, Clara could have sworn Jaden had looked back. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara Whitmore didn't feel in control. 3 days had passed, but Clara Whitmore could not stop thinking about that little girl's eyes. She had tried. She had buried herself in board meetings, reviewed acquisition proposals, even called in a crisis PR team for a minor incident that normally wouldn't have reached her desk. But none of it worked. Every time she closed her eyes, those hazel irises stared back at her wide, gentle, and impossibly familiar. Just like Jaden's when he was 4. When he used to climb into her lap and ask her questions about the moon, or why trees changed color in the fall. At night, she poured herself a glass of wine and stood in the hallway outside Jaden's locked bedroom. She hadn't stepped inside since the day after his funeral. She still couldn't. That door stayed closed just like the part of her heart that had frozen the day he died. But now there was a new question clawing at her, a question she refused to let go unanswered. So Clara made a call. Discreet, efficient. A trusted connection at a private clinic downtown. The next day, she sent a manila envelope with a coffee-stained hairbrush Danielle had left behind at the cemetery bench, along with a glove Nyla had dropped without noticing. She included a copy of Jaden's genetic profile from his pediatric records. She told them to keep it quiet. 2 days later, the results arrived. Clara opened the report at her desk alone. Her hands didn't shake, but her pulse thudded loud in her ears. The words were clinical, direct, confirmed biological relation, 99.9% certainty. Jaden Whitmore was Nyla Harper's biological father. Clara let the paper fall gently onto the glass tabletop. She stared at it, unmoving, for a long while. When she finally reached for her phone, she was calm, focused. David, she said to her assistant, get in touch with that girl, Miss Harper. Tell her I want to see her. Here, tomorrow, 10 o'clock sharp. Yes, ma'am. She hung up without another word. The next morning, Danielle stood in the marble lobby of Whitmore Holdings, staring up at the atrium like it belonged to another planet. She wore a charcoal blazer and black slacks, her only professional outfit cleaned, pressed, and slightly frayed at the seams. Her fingers clutched a small purse tightly at her side. The receptionist gave her a once-over before handing her a visitor badge and pointing her toward the elevator. Top floor, she said curtly. Danielle stepped inside the elevator alone, heart pounding. The ride was smooth and silent, but each floor she passed made her stomach twist tighter. When the doors opened to the 60th floor, she was met by a man in a dark suit. Miss Harper, he asked. Danielle nodded. This way. The hallway was lined with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, modern art, and thick rugs that muffled every step. At the end of the corridor, 2 massive glass doors opened into an office the size of a small home. Clara sat behind a sleek black desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Come in, Clara said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Close the door. Danielle did as she was told, then sat down without being invited. Clara noticed, but said nothing. For a moment, they sat in silence. The city skyline stretched endlessly behind Clara's shoulders, and for a second, Danielle wondered if the chair had been placed slightly lower on purpose. Clara reached into a drawer and pulled out a slim envelope. I had a DNA test done, she said without preamble. Danielle's eyes flickered. Her voice remained even. I figured. Clara placed the envelope in the center of the desk, but didn't slide it forward. There's no question anymore. She's his. Danielle nodded slowly. I never lied to you. Clara tilted her head. You didn't tell me everything either. I told you what mattered. Clara smiled, tight-cold. I'll be blunt. I want custody. Danielle's breath caught. Clara continued, voice-controlled. Neela is my granddaughter. She deserves access to everything my son would have given her education safety opportunity, and you can't provide that. Danielle straightened in her chair. She has love. She has stability. She has me. Clara didn't blink. That's not enough. She reached into a leather folder, pulled out a check, and laid it on the desk. The amount written in careful black ink, $300,000. Danielle stared at it for several long seconds. Her face didn't change. You'll have visitation rights, Clara said smoothly. Weekends, holidays. We'll make arrangements. Danielle looked up, her voice slow and deliberate. You're offering me $300,000 to give you my daughter. Clara's eyes didn't move from hers. To give her a better future. Danielle leaned forward, placing her hands flat on her knees. You think money makes you a better mother? I think it gives her chances you can't. Danielle swallowed hard. Her heart was pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Neela is not for sale. Clara raised an eyebrow. This isn't about you, Miss Harper. It's about what's best for her. I agree, Danielle said, which is why she stays with the person who has bathed her, fed her, read to her, held her during every nightmare, and told her every day that she's loved. Clara leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Don't get emotional. Danielle shook her head. I'm not emotional. I'm telling you the truth. Clara's jaw clenched. You're a waitress. Danielle nodded. Yes, and still, I've kept her safe. I've kept her happy. Not once has she gone to bed afraid or hungry. Can you say the same about the child you raised? The words landed like a crack across the glass. Clara's face twitched. She stood up slowly. You have no idea what you're turning down. Danielle rose too. No, I do, she said quietly, and that's why I'm saying no. She looked down at the check, then back at Clara. Neela doesn't need your money. She needs someone who sees her as a person, not a transaction. Clara stepped closer. You're making a mistake. Danielle held her ground. Maybe, but I'd rather make it with integrity than sell the only thing that's ever made sense in my life. She turned and walked toward the door. Her hand paused on the handle. Without turning around, she said, I promised I would protect her, and I will. Then she opened the door and walked out. Clara didn't move for a long time after the door closed behind Danielle. The office was silent except for the faint hum of traffic far below and the steady ticking of the antique clock on the far wall. The check still lay on the table between them, untouched. $300,000 meant to solve a problem quickly, cleanly, and permanently. Clara had expected hesitation, even some resistance. But not that. She walked slowly back to her desk and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. Her gaze lingered on the empty chair across from her. She had faced off against boardroom titans, outmaneuvered political committees, crushed hostile takeovers with a single phone call. But that young woman, barely 30, dressed in secondhand clothes, had just stood her ground and walked away without blinking. Clara wasn't used to being told no, and she had certainly never been told it with such quiet conviction. She leaned back, pressed her fingertips together, and stared out at the skyline. Her mind was already shifting into motion. The offer hadn't worked. Sentiment hadn't worked. Now it would be about strategy, precision. She would do what she had always done, eliminate the obstacle, and protect the legacy. Across town, Danielle stepped off the elevator into the crowded subway station. She kept her head down, her jaw tight. The platform smelled like metal and hot rubber, and the sound of a train rumbled in the distance, but she barely heard it. Her hands were still shaking, shoved deep into her coat pockets. The voice inside her kept whispering, "You did the right thing. You did the right thing." But it didn't calm the anger rising in her chest, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. Clara Whitmore had looked her in the eye and tried to put a price on the only thing that mattered, as if love had a ceiling, as if motherhood could be transferred with a check. Danielle bit the inside of her cheek, eyes stinging. She's not taking her, Danielle thought. I don't care how rich she is. I don't care how powerful she thinks she is. She's not taking Neela. Not now. Not ever. Back at Whitmore Holdings, Clara stood up from her desk and pressed the button on the intercom. David, she said, voice cool, deliberate. Yes, ma'am, come in here. A few moments later, David stepped into the office, tablet in hand. Clara didn't waste time. I want everything you can find on Danielle Harper, she said. Employment history, education, family background, financial records, housing situation. Anything and everything. David hesitated slightly, then nodded. Discreetly, Clara added, she doesn't know yet, but she will soon. Then she turned back toward the window, her voice almost to herself. She wants to play defense. Fine, let her. I've already won bigger battles than this. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The war had just begun. Clara Whitmore had built her empire on information gathering, it owning it, weaponizing it when necessary. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Control of markets, narratives, outcomes. And now, as she sat in her private office with the city skyline behind her and a folder of neatly typed pages before her, she felt the familiar clarity that had guided her to the top. Just 2 days later, she had all the documents she needed in her hands. She flipped open the folder. Her assistant David stood nearby, silent, waiting for instructions. Clara adjusted her reading glasses and began scanning the first page. A photo of Danielle Harper was paperclipped to the corner, candid, grainy, likely taken from a distance. Let's begin, Clara said without looking up. David nodded. Miss Harper, age 27, lives in South Hill, rents a one-bedroom unit above a liquor store, pays month to month, usually on time. No college degree. Completed high school at Fairview Public Class of 2014. Clara turned the page. Employment currently works 60 hours a week, split between 2 jobs. Waitress at Melba's Diner and part-time janitor at Westwood Elementary. No benefits. Minimum wage both places. Clara didn't respond. She flipped through the next few pages, each filled with more of the same paycheck stubs, rent receipts, a utility shutoff warning from 6 months ago, a food pantry record. She has no savings, Clara asked. David shook his head. None. No assets. No car, she takes the bus. No family we could find. No record of higher education or training. Clara closed the folder slowly, resting both hands on the leather cover. She's raising my granddaughter, in that David remained silent. He had learned over the years when not to speak. She turned down $300,000, Clara said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. For what? Pride. Clara stood and walked to the window, gazing out over the stretch of buildings below. She lives in poverty, she continued, struggles to put food on the table, and she thinks that qualifies her to raise the heir of the Whitmore name. David took a cautious step forward. Ma'am, I know this is personal, but before we move forward, I have to ask, are you sure this is the route you want to take? Clara turned slowly, her eyes cold and unwavering. Start drafting the petition, custody challenge. I want everything filed by the end of next week. David paused, then nodded once and left the room. Clara remained at the window. It wasn't anger anymore. Not exactly. It was resolve. She had spent her entire life preserving the value of the Whitmore legacy. Her son had been groomed to carry it forward. And now, with Jaden gone, the only living piece of him was a 4-year-old girl being raised in a rundown apartment by a woman who had no formal education, no wealth, no structure. Clara wasn't doing this out of spite. At least that's what she told herself. She was doing what had to be done, what any mother in her position would do. Jaden had made a mistake. Maybe out of love. Maybe out of loneliness. Maybe he'd been manipulated. But whatever had happened, Clara would not let that girl grow up without direction, without resources, without standards. She walked back to her desk, opened her laptop, and began writing an email to her attorneys. Meanwhile, across the city, Danielle sat on the floor of her apartment folding Nyla's laundry. The little girl was asleep on the couch, a pink stuffed giraffe tucked under one arm. The television was off. The heater clicked loudly in the corner. Danielle had been thinking about that meeting at Whitmore Holdings ever since she walked out of the building. She kept replaying it in her head, Clara's cold stare. The check, the way the air in the room had felt like glass, beautiful, expensive, and ready to cut. She didn't regret walking away, but she wasn't naive. She knew what came next. Still, she had hoped Clara would take the hint. Let things be. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Danielle opened it to find a courier standing in the hallway. Danielle Harper. She nodded. Delivery for you. He handed her a thick envelope, signed a tablet, and walked away. Danielle closed the door, her stomach turning before she even opened it. Inside was a formal notice intent to file for full custody of Nyla Whitmore. Attached were pages of documentation, Danielle's employment record, income statements, housing report, and a list of concerns regarding her ability to provide a stable environment. She stood still for a long moment, reading and rereading the opening paragraph. Then she slowly sank onto the edge of the couch, the envelope slipping to the floor beside her. She wasn't angry yet. That would come later. Right now, she felt something deeper. Violated. Clara had gone digging into her paychecks, her rent, her schedule, her quiet little life that she had built piece by piece since the day Nyla was born. Danielle ran a hand over her face and exhaled hard through her nose. Then she looked over at her daughter, still fast asleep, safe and warm, and unaware that her world was being targeted by someone who saw her as a mistake. No, this wasn't just legal. It was personal. Danielle stood up, crossed the room, and picked up the envelope again. If Clara Whitmore wanted a fight, she would get one, but not the kind she was used to. Danielle sat at her kitchen table, the official custody petition spread out in front of her, surrounded by a mess of highlighters, legal pads, and worn-out law textbooks. The apartment was quiet except for the steady hum of the radiator and the occasional shifting of floorboards above. Nyla had fallen asleep earlier after story time, curled in bed, with her favorite blanket, unaware of the battle already being drawn around her. Danielle leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. She wasn't surprised by Clara's move. Hurt, yes, but surprised, not even a little. She knew the moment she walked out of that glass fortress and left the check untouched that Clara wouldn't let it go. Women like her never did. Clara wasn't used to losing, especially not to someone like Danielle, a black single mother from South Hill with no degree and no last name that meant anything in a boardroom. But what Clara didn't know, what no one knew, was that Danielle had been preparing for this day for nearly 3 years. The day Jaden died, something in Danielle had shifted. She had grieved, yes, quietly, in private, but grief wasn't the only thing that came with his death. There were questions, doubts, things he had said in passing that didn't sit right, names he had mentioned, stories he had started but never finished. And one night, sitting alone on the floor beside Nyla's crib, Danielle had made a decision. She would not only protect the child Jaden had left behind, she would find the truth he never got the chance to speak. That's when she enrolled in night school. She worked 60 hours a week, took classes 4 nights out of 7, and read law textbooks during her lunch breaks. She studied contract law while doing laundry, memorized civil procedure while waiting for the bus. Every exam passed was another brick in the foundation she was building beneath her and Neela's life. She didn't tell anyone, not even her coworkers, because no one expects a waitress to become a strategist, and that was her greatest advantage. Across the city, Clara sat in her townhouse library, swirling a glass of bourbon, rereading a copy of the surveillance logs her private team had compiled. Photos, notes, apartment sketches, work schedules. Danielle's routine had been laid out like a map. Melba's diner from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., Westwood Elementary from 5 to 9. Classes every other evening at a community college on the south end of town. Clara's brow tightened. "She's studying law," she muttered. David stood near the bookshelf, arms folded. "Yes, ma'am. Started just a few months after Mr. Jaden passed. Quiet enrollment. Doesn't post about it anywhere. No public record unless you know where to look." Clara stared at the report. Her voice was quieter now. Why David didn't answer? Because he knew Clara already had. Back in the apartment, Danielle clicked open her laptop and scrolled through a folder she'd been curating for over 2 years. Emails, signed statements, screenshots, invoices, corporate records, all tied to one thing. Whitmore Holdings. Jaden hadn't said much, but he had said enough to spark curiosity. And as Danielle followed the breadcrumbs news articles, old court filings, whispers buried in public archives, she had started to see the pattern. The shell companies, the no-bid contracts, the consulting fees paid to government officials. None of it loud, all of it precise. That's when she reached out to her first ally. Amanda Pierce had been a journalist with the Metropolitan for over a decade, known for her in-depth work on corporate corruption and civil justice. Danielle had messaged her anonymously at first, attaching only one redacted invoice and a note, "This is just the surface." Amanda had replied the next day. Now she was on board. The second ally was legal. Franklin and Wells, a small firm with a big reputation in civil rights law. One of their senior partners had taken interest in the case pro bono after Danielle's file was forwarded through back channels. Custody based on class prejudice, they called it. A test case for systemic bias in family court. Danielle didn't need the legal lingo. She just needed someone who would fight like hell for her and her daughter. They were ready, but she wasn't going to strike first. Not yet. Across town, Clara stared at the law school Danielle was attending. She had a copy of the class scheduled the professors' names. She knew her GPA. Clara Whitmore didn't believe in surprises, and this was becoming one she didn't like. "She's not the same woman I met at the cemetery," Clara said aloud, not expecting a reply. David shifted slightly. "No," he agreed, "she's not." Clara didn't speak for a long moment. Then she placed the file down. "I want a full risk assessment," she said. "If she's being coached, I want to know by who. If she's planning anything, I want it before it hits a courtroom." David nodded and left the room. Alone, Clara stared at the flames in the fireplace. Something had changed. She could feel it. This wasn't about charity anymore, or even control. It was becoming personal. She had underestimated Danielle, and that was a mistake she didn't often make twice. Back in the apartment, Danielle clicked her screen off and walked down the hallway to Neela's room. She peeked inside. The little girl was still asleep, her arms wrapped around the worn giraffe, her chest rising and falling gently. Danielle stepped inside quietly and knelt beside the bed. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She whispered, "I've got you. No matter what. No one's taking you from me." Then she sat there just watching her daughter sleep, holding on to the only thing that had ever made her feel truly powerful. Clara Whitmore didn't panic easily. She was a woman of calculations, not emotions. But as she stood in her office, gripping the tablet that displayed Danielle's video, now viral across every social media platform, she felt something in her chest she hadn't felt in decades. Heat. Rising, uncontrollable heat. Rage. The kind that made her teeth press together and her hand trembled just slightly behind her back. The kind she usually reserved for CEOs who thought they could out-negotiate her in public. And now, all of that fury was directed at a woman who just months ago had been invisible to her, irrelevant, unworthy of acknowledgement. That same woman now had millions watching her calmly expose everything Clara had buried for years. In the video, Danielle didn't cry. She didn't yell. That was what made it more dangerous. Her tone was even, her expression focused, and the evidence page after page of contracts, wire transfers, timelines, and names was laid out with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Clara's name was said 17 times in the first 6 minutes. The Whitmore Holdings logo appeared in the background of emails and scanned invoices. The documents were watermarked, verified, dates matched, signatures aligned, and the allegations were not soft. Corruption, bribery, unfair labor practices, tax manipulation, even silence payouts to former employees. Clara lowered the tablet and looked out the window, her jaw tight. "Get legal on the phone," she said. "I want every platform threatened. I want takedown orders issued by the end of the hour." David, standing across the room, didn't move. "They've already tried. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, none of them are cooperating. The video's been duplicated too many times. It's gone decentralized." Clara turned to him sharply, then hit the woman directly. "I want a cease and desist in her inbox, right now." David hesitated. "That's not going to help, Clara. People are already calling it retaliation. If we push harder, push anyway," she snapped. "I don't care what it looks like." But even Clara knew the truth. She was no longer shaping the story. She was chasing it, and Danielle had moved first. 3 days earlier, Danielle had sat alone in her living room staring at the last rejection email from a national newspaper. It was polite, measured, and hollow. "We appreciate your bravery, but due to legal exposure and pressure from outside counsel, we are unable to publish your material at this time." She didn't need to read between the lines. Clara had reached them. One by one, the doors had shut, but Danielle didn't scream. She didn't even sigh. She turned off her lamp, closed her eyes, and laid perfectly still for 5 minutes. And then she got back up and turned on her laptop. The video she filmed wasn't glamorous. Her voice cracked once. She stumbled over 2 legal terms. The lighting was uneven, but the facts were nuclear. She named names, showed evidence, linked everything Clara thought she'd hidden: every dirty deal, every government contact, every falsified record. Danielle had not only prepared to defend herself, she had spent 3 years preparing to strike. She knew Clara's moves before Clara made them. She knew how to thread a narrative, how to hold eye contact with the camera, how to stay calm while speaking about a billionaire trying to rip her daughter away. She ended the video with one sentence: "No one, not even Clara Whitmore, gets to rewrite this story." She posted it across all platforms at once: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, TikTok, YouTube. She copied every link, sent them to every inbox, every contact, every reporter who had once told her no. Then she shut her laptop and went to bed. By morning, it had passed 100,000 views. By afternoon, 600,000. By nightfall, the hashtags were trending nationwide. #Justice for Nyla, #Whitmore exposed, #She fought back. It wasn't just the video, it was the fury. The collective rage of people who had been dismissed, overlooked, trampled by systems that bent to the will of wealth. Danielle had touched a nerve. She had done what so many wished they could do: look the powerful in the eye and say no, and then prove why that no mattered. More stories poured in. Former employees, warehouse managers, interns, government clerks. Quiet voices who had long been silenced were now typing paragraphs in Danielle's comment section. A woman from Detroit said her husband had lost his job at Whitmore Logistics after refusing to falsify safety reports. A man from Texas posted photos of his injury from a factory where the company had allegedly cut corners on equipment. A tax consultant hinted that he had information that would make the IRS and SEC blink twice. The pressure boiled over fast. The Metropolitan Journal published an exposé within 36 hours, citing independent verification of Danielle's documents. 2 other outlets followed. CNN ran a 10-minute segment. Then the bombshell hit the SEC, released a public statement confirming an active inquiry into Whitmore Holdings. Hours later, the FBI requested sealed corporate records from Whitmore's main legal division. Inside Clara's office, the tension was no longer quiet. Her legal team sat around the conference table, each of them offering measured suggestions on damage control, reputation repair, possible settlement options. Clara didn't speak for most of the meeting. She simply sat there, her eyes scanning every headline on the wall-mounted television. The images were unrelenting. Her name, her face, her empire, all unraveling. She finally stood, walked to the window, and said, without turning around, "Find something. Anything." I want her stopped. Back in her modest apartment, Danielle sat on the floor beside Neela, helping her color in a picture of a lion with bright orange crayons. Her phone vibrated every 30 seconds, but she didn't reach for it. Amanda Pierce had just called to confirm the first federal subpoenas were being issued. A government watchdog had launched an ethics review. The board of Whitmore Holdings was holding an emergency session without Clara present. Danielle didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She just kept coloring, because she knew this was just the beginning. The system hadn't wanted to hear her story, so she'd gone to the people. And the people had listened, not because she had money, not because she had influence, but because she had proof, and the will to speak when everyone else had stayed silent. She looked over at Nyla, who smiled back at her, completely unaware of the war her mother had just ignited. Danielle leaned over and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "It's your story now, baby," she whispered, "and nobody's taking it from you." The invitation hadn't come in the form of a letter or a phone call. It was a quiet request passed through legal channels after the federal investigation began heating up. A suggestion that perhaps a conversation face-to-face might resolve what courtrooms never could. Danielle stood at the front entrance of the Whitmore estate once more, not as a frightened girl in a service uniform, but as a woman who had survived Clara's wrath and was now about to dismantle the foundation of her entire reality. The butler opened the door without a word. No greetings, no glances, just a silent gesture toward the grand staircase. Danielle walked in heels, softly tapping against the marble floor that once tried to erase her presence. Her breath was steady, her hands calm, but inside her chest her heart thudded with the weight of what she was about to say. Clara waited in the study, the same room where so many of her business deals were crafted, where she had signed billion-dollar contracts and fired executives with the flick of a pen. Now she sat in silence, staring out the tall windows as if hoping the city below would offer her an escape. But there was none. Not anymore. Danielle didn't sit. She stood feet planted firm, looking directly at the woman who had tried to buy her silence, then crush her completely. "I didn't come here to negotiate." Danielle said, her voice steady. "I came to tell you what you should have known from the beginning." Clara didn't move. Danielle took a breath. "You remember Elijah Black, don't you? That got Clara's attention." Her eyes narrowed. "My cousin. The one who tried to steal board seats." "Yes, I remember him. He didn't try to steal anything. You stripped him of his stake in the company through a fake audit and backdoor dealings. You ruined him." Clara's jaw tightened. "He was disloyal. He was family." Danielle shot back eyes hard. "And Jessica was his daughter." Clara blinked confused. Jessica. Danielle nodded slowly. "Jessica, your niece. The one you blacklisted from every internship program in your empire after Elijah's downfall. The one who disappeared from your world quietly so she wouldn't have to see your face again." Silence filled the room like smoke. "She met Jaden in college," Danielle continued. "They kept it secret because they knew you'd never approve. She was the daughter of your enemy, and she was black." Clara's lips parted slightly, a whisper of disbelief. "They were in love," Danielle said. "Real love. Not some college fling they were planning to tell you. But Jessica got pregnant, and Jaden begged her to wait until he could figure out how to explain it to you, how to make you listen." Clara looked away, but Danielle wasn't finished. "Jessica died in childbirth. The hospital called it complications. But she was alone, Clara. No one was with her, not even Jaden, because he was away meeting with someone your lawyers sent." Clara turned sharply. "What are you saying?" Danielle's voice didn't waver. "I'm saying you hired people to clean up what you saw as a mess. You sent men to pressure Jaden. You told them to make the problem disappear. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Jaden came back that night devastated, angry, and broken." "No," Clara said quietly. "No, that's not true. He never told you because he never got the chance," Danielle said. "A week later, Jaden died in that so-called accident. But we both know it wasn't an accident. You set a chain of events in motion that destroyed every life in its path, including your own son's." Clara's voice cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," Danielle replied, "because Jessica was my best friend. I was there when she cried, when she bled, when she begged for Jaden to call her back. I was there when she died. And I held Nyla in my arms the day she was born. I've raised her ever since." Clara's knees gave out and she collapsed into the armchair behind her. The woman who once stood taller than skyscrapers now looked impossibly small. "You lied to me," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "You let me believe." "I never said I was Neela's mother," Danielle said. "You assumed. You wanted the story to be simple, something you could fight, manipulate, control. But the truth isn't that easy, Clara, and you don't get to rewrite it." Tears began to form in Clara's eyes, but Danielle didn't offer comfort. "Not yet. You looked at me and saw a servant trying to climb above her place. You saw a black woman and thought threat, liar, opportunist. You never once asked who Jessica was to me, who Neela was. You never stopped to consider that love could look different than you imagined." Clara's voice trembled. "I didn't know. I didn't mean for." Danielle's voice sharpened. "But you did. You meant to protect your legacy, your name, your power, and it cost you everything. Your cousin, your niece, your son, all gone because of your arrogance." Clara buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I thought I was doing what was best for the family." "You were doing what was best for your ego," Danielle said coldly. "You couldn't stand the idea of Jaden making his own choices, loving someone without your approval, building a life that didn't revolve around your empire, and now he's gone." Silence hung in the air, heavy, raw. "I came here because the truth matters," Danielle said after a long pause. "Neela deserves to grow up knowing where she came from. She deserves to know that her parents loved each other, that they didn't hide out of shame, but out of fear." Clara slowly looked up. Her face was pale, lined with years of denial collapsing all at once. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Danielle's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I don't want your money. I don't want your company. I want you to understand what you've done. I want you to stop pretending this was all someone else's fault, because it wasn't. It was yours." Clara sat in silence, the truth finally too loud to ignore. "You can't undo it," Danielle said gently, "but you can stop fighting the people who are trying to heal from it." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes filled with regret so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. Danielle turned toward the door. "Danielle," Clara called softly. Will you tell her about Jaden?" Danielle paused. "When she's old enough, when she can understand, I'll tell her everything." And then she was gone. Clara remained in the chair, unmoving, surrounded by the ghosts of choices she could never take back. Her empire was still standing for now, but everything that made her human had crumbled to dust. Her son, her niece, her legacy. And it all began with a lie. The courthouse was colder than usual that morning. The walls were lined with faces, press protesters, corporate watchdogs, and silent citizens who had followed the case for months, like a long, painful documentary finally nearing its final act. But no one sat with heavier silence than Danielle Harper. She was seated near the back of the courtroom, hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the judge, her breath shallow but steady. Nyla wasn't with her. Danielle had left her at home with Helen. This wasn't a moment for a child to witness. Clara Whitmore stood across the room in an iron gray suit. Her posture was still dignified, her chin lifted slightly, but the woman behind those eyes had changed. Her lawyers flanked her on either side, like armor that no longer offered protection. She looked thinner. Her once firm expression was now tight with fear and something that resembled remorse. But regret didn't erase crime. It only made the sentence harder to swallow. The judge reviewed the charges: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, money laundering, and complicity in a series of activities that, though legal teams danced around the exact language, had ultimately led to the death of her own son. And when the judge reached the final item on the docket, the courtroom fell so silent that even the scribbling pens stopped. "In the matter of legal guardianship and inheritance," the judge said, pausing, "this court finds that the minor child, Neela J. Black, is the rightful heir of Jaden Whitmore's estate. Full custodial guardianship remains with Miss Danielle Harper until the minor comes of age." There was no cheer, no applause, only silence, a breath. A single exhale from Danielle, as though she had been holding it for 3 years and could finally let it go. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes didn't move. Not even when Clara shifted in her chair, as though the verdict had shattered something deeper than pride. And regarding the charges brought against Miss Clara Whitmore, the judge continued, voice even but sharp, "This court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole after 12 contingent on cooperation with ongoing investigations." The gavel came down clean and final. Danielle didn't smile. She didn't cry either. As the bailiff escorted Clara from the courtroom, there was a flicker of eye contact between the two women. Clara looked exhausted. Her hands were cuffed, her once golden future reduced to government-issued cloth, and a number etched on a file. But it was her eyes that Danielle noticed most. For the first time, they looked human. Not powerful, not superior. Just human. Broken, but no longer blind. Danielle stood and quietly made her way out of the courtroom. The reporters tried to speak to her. Microphones and cameras shoved toward her face. "Miss Harper, how does it feel? Will you take over Whitmore Holdings now that Neela's the heir? Do you consider this justice?" She didn't answer. She stepped past them all, through the doors and down the concrete steps into the sunlight of a city that had watched her fight tooth and nail for a child that wasn't even hers by blood, but entirely hers by heart. Outside, Helen was waiting with Nyla in her arms. The little girl saw Danielle and wriggled down, running across the plaza in her red sneakers. Mommy Danielle knelt to the ground and scooped her up, holding her close. "Did we win?" Neela asked, her big brown eyes searching her face. Danielle kissed her forehead. "We did what was right, baby. That's what matters." They sat on a bench nearby as the crowd thinned. Helen joined them, placing a comforting hand on Danielle's shoulder. The city buzzed around them. Horns, footsteps, life. "She didn't even look angry anymore," Danielle said quietly. Helen nodded. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way people realize what they had." "I don't feel like I won," Danielle added. "I just feel relieved. Like maybe Jaden and Jessica can rest now." Helen squeezed her shoulder. Justice isn't about celebration. It's about closure. And that was the truth. Danielle hadn't fought this hard to gloat. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want the empire. All she ever wanted was to protect Nyla and give Jessica's memory the dignity it deserved. Later that week, legal documents were finalized. Ownership of multiple trusts and assets was transferred into a protected account under Nyla's name. An independent trustee had been assigned. Danielle reviewed everything carefully, not as someone eager for wealth, but as someone who understood that power in the wrong hands destroys everything it touches. One morning, Danielle stood before the large window in her modest apartment, Neela still asleep in the bedroom. The city stretched far beyond the glass, unaware of the storm it had just weathered. She looked down at the file folder resting on the table, Nyla's future, in legal terms. Assets, properties, residual shares. She closed the folder and whispered to herself, "You're safe now, baby girl." Meanwhile, in a correctional facility nearly 5 hours away, Clara Whitmore sat alone in a beige-walled visitation room. The sharp lines of her designer persona had dulled into state-issued gray. Her hair had grown out slightly streaks of white, now unapologetically exposed. A guard dropped a letter in front of her. It had been screened already. The return address read simply D. Harper. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning the single sheet inside. It wasn't long. It was a photo. Nyla, in a blue dress, holding a violin. Smiling. A sticky note had been placed beside it. "She's learning to play just like her dad. I thought you should know." Clara's hand trembled. She didn't cry. Not yet. But something in her chest cracked open. Something that years of dominance, wealth, and strategy had tried to bury. She looked at the photo for a long time, then carefully folded it and tucked it into the inside pocket of her jumpsuit. No one would understand. No one needed to. That smile wasn't hers, but it was all she had left. That night alone in her cell, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time, she didn't think about earnings reports or stockholders. She thought about Jaden, about Jessica, about Elijah, and about all the people she had hurt in her climb to the top. Justice hadn't knocked down her door overnight. It had crept in slowly through the cracks in her conscience, through the resistance of a woman she'd underestimated, a woman who had no title, no inheritance, no reason to keep fighting except one love. 2 years later, on a quiet Saturday morning in Brooklyn, the sun streamed through the tall windows of a modest brownstone apartment. Inside, Danielle Harper sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in one hand, a thick stack of notes in the other. She wore a clean white shirt tucked into dark slacks, her short, natural curls falling just slightly over her forehead. On the table next to the notes was a diploma, Master of Business Administration. Her name was printed in gold. In the next room, the sound of a violin floated through the air, delicate, precise, filled with focus and soul. Nyla was standing in front of the mirror, fingers sliding confidently along the strings. She was now 6 years old. Her hair had grown longer, still curly, always neatly parted with little silver clips on the sides. Her small frame moved slightly as she played, not stiff, but intentional. She had that rare stillness in her presence that only comes from someone born of both joy and pain. Danielle stood quietly in the doorway and watched her. There were no medals on the wall, no trophies, no certificates, just Neela, a child playing her instrument not to impress, not to perform, but because it connected her to something deeper. Jaden had once loved the violin too, And though Neela had never met him, it was as if his memory lived inside the music she created. When Neela stopped, she turned and saw Danielle. "Did I mess up that last part?" Danielle smiled. "You didn't mess up anything. You told the truth with it. That's what matters." Neela beamed and ran to her, hugging her waist. "Can I show Auntie Helen later?" "Of course. She'll cry again just like last time." Neela giggled. Danielle looked out the window for a moment, her mind drifting. 2 years ago, she had stepped out of a courtroom with her entire life transformed, not richer, not safer, but seen. And since then, she hadn't wasted a minute. Her MBA had opened doors she never thought would unlock. Not just for her, but for other women like her. Black women who had been labeled as less than. Women who knew pain intimately but refused to let it define them. She had begun speaking at universities, women's shelters, community events. Not for applause, but for the truth. She didn't come with slogans or TED Talk polish. She came with scars and strategy. She spoke about resilience, about raising a child that wasn't hers by blood but had become her purpose. She talked about power, real power, and how it never looked like the ones who tried to steal Neela away. Sometimes when she walked off stage, young women would come up with tears in their eyes. "You made me believe I'm worth fighting for. I never thought someone like me could do it. You reminded me I'm not invisible." And every time Danielle would hold their hands, look them in the eye, and say the same thing. "You're not invisible. They just don't want to see you. But we're going to make them." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in a women's correctional facility upstate, Clara Whitmore sat alone in the prison library. Her hair had gone fully gray now. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, were dimmed by time and silence. She no longer walked like a CEO. She walked like a woman carrying a weight no sentence could ever fully measure. Every Wednesday morning she sat at the same desk and waited. The other inmates had stopped asking what she was waiting for. They called her the lady with the picture because each week she received one envelope. Inside was always the same thing, a single photo. No return address, no letter, just Neela. One week it was Nyla standing in front of her school. Another week Neela at the park. Neela on stage holding a small bouquet. Neela with Helen. Neela with Danielle. Nyla painting. Nyla dancing. Nyla playing her violin. And Clara kept every photo. She had no shelf, so she made one from 2 books and a folded towel. The pictures were lined up neatly in her cell next to her bed, not for anyone else, just her. Each smile on that child's face was a reminder of something she had tried to destroy but had failed, because love had won, because truth had surfaced, because justice had a long memory. That morning, she opened the new envelope with hands that shook slightly. It was a photo of Neela holding a sign at a school fair. The sign read, "I'm playing for Dad today." Clara closed her eyes. Her throat tightened. And for the first time in 2 years, she let herself say it out loud in a whisper no one else could hear. "I'm sorry." She wasn't talking to Danielle. She wasn't even talking to Nyla. She was talking to Jaden, to Jessica, to the young lovers she had erased in the name of control, to a family she'd dismantled out of fear. Her cellmate walked in, noticed her sitting still, the photo trembling in her hands. "That your granddaughter?" the woman asked softly. Clara nodded once. "She's beautiful," the woman added. "She's everything I wasn't," Clara replied. Outside the prison, the world moved on. Whitmore Holdings had been restructured. The Whitmore name was still on the building, but it no longer belonged to Clara. She hadn't asked who took over. She didn't want to know. The past no longer gave her comfort. It only reminded her how much she had lost in the pursuit of power. That weekend back in Brooklyn, Neela stood on the stage at her school's recital hall, her bow pressed gently to the strings. The room fell silent as she played. Danielle sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly. Helen beside her, a tissue already in hand. The music poured out, sweet, strong, and unshaken. It was the kind of performance that didn't ask for praise. It simply asked to be felt. And in that moment, everyone in the room felt it. When the performance ended, the applause filled the hall. Danielle stood slowly wiping her eyes. She looked at Nyla and knew with unshakable certainty this child would never be owned, never be silenced, never be hidden. She had survived a storm she didn't even know had been built around her, and now she was blooming. Later that night, as they walked home under a soft evening sky, Neela looked up. "Mommy." "Yeah, baby. Do you think Daddy hears me when I play?" Danielle paused, then nodded. "I think he never stopped listening." The air was warm with the final touch of summer as the sun began its descent behind the trees. The golden light spilled through the tall windows of the community music center, brushing gently over the polished wood floors and the instruments resting neatly on their stands. Inside the main room, Neela stood barefoot on a small stage, her tiny fingers adjusting the violin chin rest, eyes, focused posture, calm but poised. She had grown taller since the last recital. Her curls now reached just past her shoulders, tucked neatly behind her ears. At only 8 years old, she already carried herself with a stillness that was both learned and inherited. From the second row of folding chairs, Danielle watched in silence. She wore a navy blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, her MBA ring glinting faintly under the lights. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, but her shoulders were relaxed. Helen sat beside her, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her silver braids pinned neatly, chin held high. Neither woman spoke. They didn't need to. The room was filled with other parents and families murmuring softly, some checking their phones, others whispering notes to their children. But for Danielle, the noise faded as she watched Neela take a deep breath and draw the bow across the strings. The first note cut through the room like quiet lightning. It was not loud, it was not showy, but it was clean, clear, confident. A sound that had been practiced in the early mornings before school, in the evenings after homework, and sometimes in the stillness of grief. Danielle leaned forward just a little, her eyes wet but unblinking. When Neela finished, she held her final note for a heartbeat longer than expected, then slowly lowered the violin to her side. The applause was instant and warm. Some parents clapped politely. A few offered standing ovations. But Danielle didn't clap. Not yet. She just stared chest tight with something deeper than pride. It was reverence. When Nyla stepped off the stage and made her way down the aisle, Danielle finally stood and met her halfway. She knelt down, looked her straight in the eyes, and said softly, "You were brilliant." Nyla grinned. "You think Dad would have liked it?" Danielle nodded, her voice catching. "I think he would have cried." Helen walked up behind them and placed a hand on Danielle's shoulder. "And I think he'd be proud of you too," she whispered. That evening, the three of them walked home together, the streets glowing orange in the long sunset. Nyla skipped slightly ahead, humming the melody she'd just performed, while Danielle and Helen walked side by side. After dinner, while Neela brushed her teeth, Danielle stepped onto the balcony, the city humming quietly around her. Helen joined her 2 mugs of tea in hand. "She's becoming something rare," Helen said, handing over a cup. "She already is," Danielle replied. "She just doesn't know it yet." Helen took a sip, then leaned against the railing. "Do you remember when you brought her home for the first time? You were shaking like a leaf." Danielle smiled at the memory. "I wasn't ready, but I knew I had to be." Helen turned, voice more serious. "You could have walked away, Danielle. Nobody would have judged you." Danielle looked down into her tea. "I know, but I made Jessica a promise. I told her I'd protect her daughter like my own, and I meant it." Helen studied her for a moment, then smiled with quiet pride. "You did more than protect her. You gave her a future they tried to erase." Nyla stepped onto the balcony a moment later, now in her pajamas holding her violin. "Can I play one more song before bed?" she asked. Danielle and Helen exchanged a smile. "Of course," baby Danielle said. Nyla walked to the edge of the balcony, the fading sunlight catching her profile as she positioned the violin. Below them, the city moved without noticing. But for the 3 women on that quiet balcony, time slowed. Danielle placed a hand on Neela's shoulder gently before she played. "I want you to remember something," she said softly. "Your mind is your weapon, baby. It's the one thing no one can ever take from you. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, you carry power they can't touch." Neela looked up at her wide-eyed and nodded. "I promise." Then she lifted the bow and began to play. The sound rose into the evening air, floating above rooftops and traffic past windows and streetlights. It wasn't just music. It was history, memory, and hope, all tied together by the steady hand of a child who had survived more than she could name. Danielle and Helen stood in silence, watching her, letting the notes soak into their bones. Down the street, beyond a dozen corners and locked doors, a small envelope slid through a prison mail slot. Clara Whitmore sat on the edge of her cot waiting for it. When it arrived, she opened it with hands that trembled, not from age, but from everything she could never undo. Inside was a photo. Nyla, on a balcony lit by the glow of sunset violin tucked to her chin, eyes closed, smile soft. Clara stared at it for a long time, her chest rising unevenly. She reached for the folder where she kept every photo, every small reminder of a life she had once tried to erase. She held the picture against her heart and whispered, "She's free." And she cried not from guilt or shame, but from the clarity that she would never again be part of that freedom. That was her punishment, not the cell, not the walls, but the silence. Back on the balcony, the last note of Nyla's song faded into the dusk. She lowered her instrument, turned, and ran into Danielle's arms. Danielle held her tight, resting her chin on Nyla's hair. She didn't need to say anything. Everything they had fought for, lost, and rebuilt had led to this moment. Not revenge, not victory, but peace. The story of Nyla, Danielle, and Clara was never just about loss or justice. It was about how love, when rooted in truth and nurtured with courage, can heal even the deepest wounds. It reminded us that sometimes the strongest people are the quietest ones, those who carry pain but still choose kindness, those who face cruelty but never lose their humanity. Danielle showed us that you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to stand steady in what's right. And Nyla, with her gentle smile and her violin, reminded us that hope can grow again, even in the ruins of betrayal. What about you? Has there ever been a moment in your life where you had to protect someone you loved, even when the world didn't understand, or a time when walking away would have been easier, but you stayed because it was the right thing to do? If this story touched your heart, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your reflections, your memories, or simply how this made you feel. Your voice matters here. And if you believe that stories like this can bring more compassion, understanding, and strength into the world, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who might need it today, and subscribing to our channel. Together we can keep telling stories that speak to the soul. Thank you for being here and for listening with an open heart.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.